Open your refrigerator. Take a look inside. Milk, eggs, cheese, butter, fresh vegetables, leftovers from dinner. Now ask yourself one question. What happens if the electricity goes out? For most people, the answer is simple. Not much. At least not today. The refrigerator stays cold for a while. The freezer keeps everything frozen. Life continues almost normally. But wait another day, then another. The temperature inside slowly begins to rise. Ice cream softens. Milk warms. Fresh meat becomes a concern. Suddenly, something that had always been quietly working in the background becomes impossible to ignore. The refrigerator wasn't just keeping food cold. It was quietly protecting hundreds of pounds worth of groceries every single year. That's why most people assume refrigeration is essential. Without it, food would spoil almost immediately. Or would it? Long before electric refrigerators became common, people still ate fresh food. They drank milk, stored butter, kept vegetables, made cheese, preserved meat. Communities around the world developed remarkably clever ways of slowing spoilage, using nothing more than nature, careful planning, and an understanding of temperature. Many Amish communities continue using traditional techniques alongside methods that fit the customs of their particular community. Practices vary. Some Amish households use propane-powered refrigerators. Some use natural gas. Some permit limited modern technology depending on their ordnung. Others continue relying heavily on older methods for parts of the year. That's important to understand. There isn't one Amish method. There are many. But nearly all of them share one philosophy. Work with nature instead of constantly trying to overpower it. The first method surprises almost everyone. The root cellar. To many people, a root cellar sounds old-fashioned, maybe even unnecessary. In reality, it's one of the smartest food storage systems ever developed. Go a few feet below the surface of the earth, and something interesting happens. Temperature becomes remarkably stable. During summer, underground spaces remain much cooler than the outside air. During winter, they stay much warmer than freezing outdoor temperatures. That stability is exactly what many foods need. Potatoes, carrots, beets, turnips, cabbage, apples, onions. These foods don't necessarily require refrigerator temperatures. They simply need cool, dark, humid conditions. A properly managed root cellar provides exactly that. Without a single watt of electricity. People often imagine root cellars as damp caves. The reality is usually much more organized. Shelving keeps produce separated. Ventilation helps regulate humidity. Some crops store better than others. Apples are often kept away from certain vegetables because they naturally release ethylene gas, which speeds the ripening of nearby produce. Small details like this matter. Traditional food storage wasn't guesswork. It was practical knowledge built over generations. The second method is spring houses. This may be one of the most fascinating forgotten buildings in rural history. Imagine having a constant source of cold groundwater flowing across your property. That water remains surprisingly cool throughout much of the year because it comes from underground. Instead of pumping it into a refrigerator, people once built small buildings directly over or beside the spring. Food could be placed inside where the cool flowing water naturally lowered temperatures. Milk, butter, cream, cheese, even cooked food for short periods. The moving water continuously carried away heat. It wasn't freezing. It didn't need to be. It simply slowed spoilage compared with leaving food in the summer sun. Spring houses became common in many rural areas long before electric refrigeration arrived. Today they're rare, but the science behind them hasn't changed. Cool flowing water remains one of nature's most effective cooling systems. The third method is simply timing. This one doesn't involve a building at all. Modern households buy almost everything once a week, or even once every 2 weeks. Historically, many rural families planned meals differently. Milk was used quickly. Fresh vegetables were eaten first. Foods with shorter storage lives took priority. Longer-lasting foods remained for later. Instead of asking, "How do we keep this fresh for 3 weeks?" people often asked, "What should we eat today while it's at its best?" That sounds simple, but it dramatically reduces waste. The fourth method is choosing foods that naturally store well. This may be the biggest lesson of all. Modern supermarkets have taught us to expect every food to behave the same way. In reality, they don't. Potatoes naturally last far longer than lettuce. Winter squash stores much longer than cucumbers. Hard cheeses generally keep longer than soft cheeses. Some apple varieties were specifically developed because they stored exceptionally well through winter. Traditional households often selected crops not only for flavor, but for storage. A vegetable capable of lasting several months without refrigeration had enormous value. That wasn't luck. It was careful planning. The fifth method is fermentation. People often think fermentation was invented to create unusual foods. Historically, it was about preservation. Take cabbage. Fresh cabbage eventually spoils. Turn it into sauerkraut. Stored correctly, it lasts much longer. The same principle applies to many other fermented foods. Beneficial microorganisms create conditions that discourage the growth of harmful ones. The food changes. The flavor changes. But the result often remains edible for much longer than the fresh version. That's why fermented foods appear across cultures around the world. Not because everyone happened to enjoy sour flavors, because fermentation solved a practical problem. The sixth method is butter. More specifically, turning cream into butter. Fresh cream has a relatively short life. Butter lasts much longer. Then people went one step further. Clarified butter, often called ghee in many cultures, removes much of the water and milk solids. The result stores even longer under appropriate conditions. Again, people weren't just preserving food. They were transforming it into forms that naturally lasted longer. The seventh method is cheese. Milk spoils quickly. Cheese changes the equation completely. Hard cheeses lose much of their moisture during production. Less moisture generally means fewer opportunities for spoilage organisms to grow. Some traditional cheeses were intentionally produced for long storage. Proper conditions still mattered. Temperature mattered. Humidity mattered. But compared with fresh milk, the difference was extraordinary. Instead of asking, "How do we keep milk from spoiling?" people asked, "What useful food can we turn milk into?" That's a completely different mindset. By now, you've probably noticed something. Very few of these methods actually cool food dramatically. Instead, they slow time. Every degree lower. Every bit less moisture. Every carefully chosen crop. Every preservation method. Each one buys a little more time. And when all those small advantages are combined, something remarkable happens. A household becomes far less dependent on constant electricity than most people ever imagined. But these aren't the only methods. Because some of the smartest techniques don't involve buildings or preservation at all. They involve changing the way food is produced, collected, and eaten from the very beginning. The biggest surprise about traditional food storage isn't a clever building or a forgotten tool. It's a different way of thinking. Today, many of us buy food with the expectation that a refrigerator will solve almost every storage problem. Need vegetables to last another week? Put them in the fridge. Bought extra milk? The refrigerator takes care of it. Cooked too much dinner? The refrigerator buys another few days. For generations, rural families often worked the other way around. They planned meals around what would naturally last. Instead of asking, "How can I keep this food fresh?" they asked, "How quickly should we use it?" That simple shift changed everything. Fresh milk wasn't expected to sit for a week. It was often used within a day or two. Some became butter. Some became cheese. Some became cream. Nothing stayed in one form for very long. The food itself kept changing, and every change extended its usefulness. That's a fascinating idea. Preservation wasn't always about stopping change. Sometimes it was about guiding it. One of the best examples is eggs. Many people assume eggs must always be refrigerated. In the United States, commercially sold eggs are washed before sale, removing the natural protective coating and making refrigeration important for food safety. In many other countries, including much of Europe, eggs are often left unwashed, preserving that natural bloom. When handled properly, unwashed eggs can often be stored at cool room temperatures for much longer than many people expect. Historically, families gathered fresh eggs every day. There wasn't a need to store dozens for long periods. Again, timing mattered just as much as temperature. It's another reminder that traditional households often reduce storage challenges by changing their routines. Vegetables offer another interesting lesson. Today, we refrigerate almost everything. Tomatoes, onions, potatoes, garlic. Yet many of those foods actually prefer different environments. Potatoes store best in cool, dark conditions, not in bright kitchens, not in freezing refrigerators. Onions prefer dry conditions with good airflow. Garlic behaves similarly. Squash often stores surprisingly well on pantry shelves when properly cured. Each crop has its own preferences. Traditional households didn't rely on one machine to create identical conditions for every food. Instead, they matched each food to the environment it preferred. It's a completely different system, one that's surprisingly efficient once you understand it. Another forgotten advantage was simply living closer to food. Many Amish farms produce at least part of what they eat. Gardens, orchards, dairy animals, chickens. That changes the equation. If fresh lettuce is growing outside, there isn't the same pressure to keep it fresh for 2 weeks. If eggs are collected daily, there isn't the same need to store large quantities. Distance influences storage. The farther food travels, the longer it must remain fresh. The closer food is produced, the sooner it can be eaten. That alone reduces dependence on refrigeration. One of the most overlooked traditional habits is seasonal eating. Modern supermarkets encourage us to expect strawberries in winter, pumpkins in spring, fresh tomatoes all year. Historically, people accepted seasons much more readily. Summer meant fresh berries. Autumn meant apples. Winter meant root vegetables. Spring brought new greens. Instead of forcing nature to provide every food every month, households adapted to what was naturally available. That reduced storage demands enormously. Fresh foods were enjoyed while abundant. Then, preserved foods bridged the gap until the next harvest. Nothing was expected to remain fresh forever. That's a lesson many people have forgotten. Perhaps the biggest misconception surrounding the Amish is that they avoid technology because technology is bad. The reality is much more thoughtful than that. Different Amish communities make different decisions. Some permit propane refrigerators. Some use natural gas. Others use diesel engines for certain farm tasks. The question often isn't, is this technology modern? The question is, how does this technology affect our community, our families, and our way of life? That's a very different discussion, and it explains why there's no single Amish refrigerator rule. Practices vary, but one thing appears again and again: reducing unnecessary dependence. That's where traditional food storage becomes so interesting. Imagine the electricity fails for several days. Many households immediately worry about everything inside the refrigerator. A family already relying on root vegetables, preserved foods, cheese, dried beans, fermented foods, and naturally stored produce has a very different experience. Not because they're expecting disaster, because those foods were already part of everyday life. Preparedness wasn't something special. It was simply normal. Another fascinating feature of traditional kitchens was pantry organization. Foods weren't stored randomly. Different shelves served different purposes. Dry goods remained dry. Root vegetables stayed cool. Herbs hung where air could circulate. Jars were labeled. Older foods were used first. Today we call this stock rotation. Traditional households simply called it common sense, because wasting food wasn't an option. Every preserved apple, every jar, every wheel of cheese represented work. Hours of planting, harvesting, preparing, preserving. Nothing was taken for granted. One of the most valuable lessons these traditional methods teach isn't actually about refrigerators. It's about resilience. Modern appliances are wonderful. They're safe, convenient, reliable. Very few people would willingly give them up. That's not the point. The point is understanding that households once solved many of these same problems using knowledge instead of electricity. Knowledge of temperature, knowledge of humidity, knowledge of timing, knowledge of preservation, knowledge of the seasons. That knowledge still has value today, even if every appliance in your kitchen works perfectly. Because good food storage always begins long before something enters the refrigerator. It begins with choosing the right foods, storing them correctly, using them at the right time, avoiding unnecessary waste. Those habits work with electricity, and they work without it. Perhaps that's why these traditional methods continue attracting attention. They're reminders that convenience and understanding aren't the same thing. A refrigerator is incredibly convenient, but understanding why potatoes shouldn't sit in bright sunlight, why apples affect nearby produce, why hard cheeses behave differently from soft cheeses, why root vegetables prefer cool, humid conditions. Those ideas remain useful regardless of technology. Now think back to the beginning of this video. We started with a simple question. How do the Amish keep food cold without refrigerators? The answer wasn't one secret building or one forgotten invention. It was dozens of practical decisions working together. Root cellars, spring houses, seasonal eating, fermentation, cheese making, butter production, natural storage crops, fresh food used quickly, preserved food used later. Each method solved one small part of the problem. Together, they created a remarkably resilient system, one that had been refined through observation rather than electronics, through generations rather than gadgets. And perhaps that's the most impressive part. These methods weren't designed to impress anyone. They were designed to feed families. Year after year, winter after winter, long before anyone imagined plugging a refrigerator into a wall. That's why they still matter today. Not because they replace modern refrigeration, but because they remind us that some of the smartest solutions were discovered long before electricity quietly became part of everyday life.